Good morning, everyone. I am Ernesto Burden, publisher of New Hampshire Business Review, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to our New Hampshire Business Review webinar, Your Branding Blueprint, Creating and Defending Your Business Legacy. Today's webinar is sponsored by Sheehan Phinney, and we're going to be talking, as the title suggests, about brand and both brand building. We're going to be joined by some members of a creative agency who will be talking about that, and also about the legal aspects of building your brand and how you can protect it after you've built it. Our speakers today will be Brian Thomas, who's an attorney with Sheehan Phinney, Meranne Behrends, co-founder and CEO of Words from the Woods, Greer Pearce, Chief Strategy Officer of Words from the Woods, and Kelly Scharf, Managing Director, Words from the Woods. I will be turning it over to Greer to get us started, and I'll be back at the end to ask some questions of the folks. Greer, welcome.
Hello, everyone. So nice to see everyone today. Actually, Meranne, I think, is going to take us through the beginning of this presentation, but we're excited to talk to you all about your branding blueprint today.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Greer. Who the heck is Words from the Woods? A bit of a fun name. We're an independent ad agency located in Portland, Maine, actually, giving brands a breath of fresh air. It's sort of our positioning statement for the work that we do on our end. What does that mean? So there's a little bit of context for who you're going to be hearing from today. Independent ad agency. We're a no holding company, indie, which is very important because it means we make decisions on behalf of our client partners and our team, which is very important to us. And we build and grow brands. We're going to talk a lot about brand today. It's one of our passion points here. And we give brands a breath of fresh air, which essentially means finding the human truth in any brand sort of strengths, providing differentiated white space in their category, communicating in a resonant way with customers and consumers, and of course, the most important, driving effective results in brand building. We work across many sectors. We're going to be talking today about a couple case studies. The reason I want to show many sectors is because the principles that we're talking about actually extend well beyond a specific sector. So while we may talk about an outdoors case study or perhaps an insurance case study, the principle behind it extends anything from a restaurant group to a hotel group to a manufacturer to B2B. I'll touch on those principles in a second. We are what you call a full service agency. It's a fancy way of saying soup to nuts brand building. So anything from research and strategy all the way through any given logo identification, visual identity, to campaign production, basically soup to nuts in how you build a brand and how that brand lives in the world. So what is a brand? Loaded question. Where do we turn to first to answer this question? Of course, AI. I mean, who wouldn't? The internet rather, defines a brand as a product or service that is distinguished from others so that it can easily be communicated and marketed. No offense to the internet, but we actually disagree. A brand extends well beyond a product or service. It should be a living, breathing entity that lives in the world. A brand, from our perspective, is a set of emotional drivers. We'll talk about how you unearth those emotional drivers throughout our next hour today. It is a living, breathing entity. Brands have the ability to create connections that influence behavior, albeit a very functional decision to opt into a brand or a much more emotional one. As I mentioned, these principles span different sectors and industries. And the easiest way we like to think about it, it's what people say about you when you're not in the room. That's essentially what a brand is. So At its very simplest, we've broken this down to 7 brand building principles. We're kind of going to go through each principle on its own and then provide a case study or two into unearthing how you start to get there. These are very purposefully in order, starting with find your North Star. That is, what is the mark on the wall that indicates where you're going with every single decision. If you go back one, Kelly, sorry, thank you. Find your North Star. The second is articulate the goal. Of course, goals are important, but we underline the goal for a very specific reason. We'll get into that. You want to be an expert in your category and within your competition. Some interesting ways to unearth that. Entrench yourself in your core customer. Know who you're speaking to. Know what's on their hearts and minds. And how to reach them in the most appropriate and resonant way. Get your marketing priorities straight. So this is sort of where to invest time and energy. Find your crew, a fun way of saying, locate partners that help you elevate your own brand that have a similar North Star to yours. And then interesting ways to think about charting your future. So we'll start with find your North Star. I'm going to actually pass it off to Kelly to jump in on this piece.
Thank you, Meranne. I was just finding myself starting on mute. I mean, we've only been doing this for almost 5 years, so that happens. The first principle I am pleased to talk about is find your North Star. What does that mean? That means know what your brand stands for beyond the tangibles of the product or service and live it consistently every day. Questions you can ask yourself: what is your guiding light? How focused is that guiding light? Distill your company ethos, know where you stand in the market, and then once you establish your guiding light, use that to fuel every single decision you make in the business. Saddleback Mountain is a client of ours. I'm sure there are probably some skiers and some New Englanders who know. A little history about Saddleback. Saddleback was actually opened in 1960 in Rangeley, Maine. Unfortunately, due to business decisions, change in ownership, Saddleback did close for 5 years, from 2015 to 2020. And this was a major bummer. Not only did it affect the people who loved going to the mountain, but the local economy, and really the whole region suffered. A VC firm out of Boston decided to reinvest to get Saddleback open and running again. And we began working with Saddleback in 2021 and really faced the challenge: how do we get the word out that Saddleback is back? And as we began to look for that North Star of Saddleback, we began to dive deep into the research, something that we really love here. And I think at Words from Woods sets us apart because we love data, we love getting into it, because that's where a lot of insights lie. So we were going through some consumer data and we discovered something very fascinating. We discovered that Saddleback Mountain had the highest NPS score. So it stands for Net Promoter Score of all the ski mountains of Maine. NPS score is a metric that's used to measure customer loyalty and satisfaction by asking customers, how likely would you be to recommend this company, product, ski mountain to a friend or a colleague? And Saddleback scored off the charts, even after being closed for 5 years. So we were blown away by this, and it kind of set us on our path forward. With confidence, we began to say, after a 5-year closure, Saddleback is Maine's favorite mountain. So you'll see we have a little trademark here, and this is where Brian and the team at Sheehan Phinney came in, because we were like, we're the first ones to say we're Maine's favorite mountain. We're going to put it everywhere: our website, our broadcast, our social media, on billboards, and we're like, let's trademark it. The next step I will advise should be a call to Brian at Sheehan Phinney, because not being law experts, the clients went to trademark it. We ran into some issues. However, we then did call Brian and he sorted it out for us. He guided us through the process. And now today we can proudly say that we own Maine's favorite mountain, and it has caught on. skiers love it, and our clients love it too. All right, Brian, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And again, I'm Brian Thomas at Sheehan Phinney. We're a business law firm here in Manchester, although we have offices in Boston and we practice throughout the country and globally with clients globally. And I will say from the outset, we're getting creative. We're talking about North Stars. The question is, why are we bringing lawyers in? Kelly, thank you. You gave me some credence there. But lawyers play, and a good trademark lawyer plays two important roles early in your process. And I'll describe those, but more importantly, just give you some tips and some ideas about pitfalls and things to do when you're starting this process early. And the first is clearance. A lawyer helps you clear the mark or your branding to make sure you're not infringing someone else, and also make sure it can even serve as a protectable mark, as I'll describe. And then there's the registration process that Kelly was talking about that helps you enforce your mark and keep others from using it down the road. So if we go to the next slide, before I jump in, I want to make clear, absolutely correct from Words from the Woods, that branding goes well beyond just a mark or a protected mark. But to give you a sense of some of the kinds of marks you can protect, there's word marks like Saddleback Mountain, but there's also slogans, Maine's favorite mountain. There's logos, you know the Nike swoosh, but there's also similar logos. And colors, believe it or not. So you can see the blue on the screen. That is a registered trademark from Tiffany's because that identifies Tiffany. It identifies the source of Tiffany's. And even scents and sounds. The smell of Play-Doh, believe it or not, is a registered trademark. And many sounds. Favorite of which of mine is the ho 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 from the Jolly Green Giant is a registered trademark. So you have to think broadly about your brand and what to protect. I won't be able to today go into giving specific advice on what the trademark should do, but I can tell you some pitfalls when you're looking to protect a mark or a slogan, areas where you want to be careful because you can't protect them as a trademark, or it can be difficult to do so. And the first of those is generic marks. So obviously, if you're looking to sell apples, you can't use the word apple as your brand because it's the name that describes the product, but it can be more nuanced. So Subway, the sandwich place, tried to register footlong for their subs. And because that's become a generic term in the industry for a larger sub, they couldn't do it. So you want to think about that as well. Merely descriptive marks are marks that describe a characteristic or a quality of the good or service that you're using in connection with. From a branding standpoint, you want that, right? But you may not be able to protect it as well as you could a more distinct mark. And an example you can use there is cold and creamy for ice cream. It doesn't say this is ice cream, but it describes a characteristic. Initially, that was rejected as a trademark. So you want to keep that in mind when you're picking these marks, the balance between describing the goods and service and being able to protect it. The next two areas where I say be careful are terms that only lawyers can come up with. Primarily geographically descriptive, essentially, is if your mark tells the origin or where your goods and services come from, you may not be able to protect it that way. And that could be basic. If I'm here in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I do Manchester bicycles for a bicycle company, they want to prevent me from saying bicycles from Manchester from locking that up. But it can be more nuanced. So the brand Nantucket Nectars, the drink, they're not made in Nantucket. They're not shipped from Nantucket. The only connection to Nantucket is their research and development department is on the island. And still, that trademark was rejected on that basis because it described the origin of the goods. So people want to connect it to the location, and Maine's favorite mountain was one we had to overcome that hurdle. But that is a hurdle you need to keep in mind. The next one is the flip side, which is if I have a coffee company, for example, and the beans are from Costa Rica and I roast it here in Manchester, I can't call it Hawaii coffee because consumers will be confused or misled into believing it's a Hawaiian coffee. And then the last one before we go to the next slide is surnames, last names. People want to use their last name in a mark, but even if it's not your last name, if your mark is a last name or a someone else's last name, you may not be able to register that mark because they're trying to prevent people from locking up using their last name with marks. And people are oftentimes surprised to hear that. So those are some areas where you want to keep an eye out when you're first branding. But the next question is when you're doing a clearance, a stronger mark, what are those? And again, I won't be able to get into details, but from a legal standpoint, the examples I give here are some of the stronger ways to protect it. A coined mark is a made up mark like Exxon, which before it was Exxon wasn't a word. They just made it up. it can be very hard from a branding standpoint to build a brand around it because it doesn't say anything to the consumer necessarily, but from a legal standpoint, it's very strong. Next on the list is Apple, which is, an arbitrary mark is a common term, but is used in something that doesn't make sense. So Apple for computers or devices, again, you've got to build the brand around that, but it can be a very strong brand because no one, confused about how to say Apple or spell Apple. But where I think the sweet spot is, before I move on, is suggestive marks. And suggestive marks are marks that don't flat out describe, they're not merely descriptive, the goods or services, but they suggest it. And Netflix is a great example because we all know now it's a streaming service. But before that, pretend you had never heard of Netflix before. It kind of tells you something about the good or service without describing it. Net for internet and Flix for movies. And I feel like that's the sweet spot from a branding spot if you're looking for a new slogan or you're looking for a new mark. We can go to the next slide now. So the second part of clearance that you really should rely on a lawyer for is making sure you're not infringing someone else. And everybody starts with an internet search and says, that's all I need to do. Internet search is a great place to start. You don't need a lawyer for that. Go out there and find out if anyone's got a similar mark and they're using it. It's not comprehensive, but it's a really good place to find obvious obstacles. But you need to go into the USPTO database next, and that's the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And that's the government agency that registers marks across the United States. And why you should use a lawyer in this case is because the database is not particularly user-friendly. It's getting better, but you want someone skilled in searching it. But also because the test for what a mark could be as an obstacle to you using your mark or registering your mark is not whether it's identical. It's this notion or this legal concept of likelihood of confusion. And there's a whole host of factors that are considered there if a mark is likely to cause confusion and therefore an obstacle to your use or whether you'd be infringing it. But the two biggest which are the similarities of the mark, not that it's identical, but it's similar. So does it look the same? Does it sound the same phonetically? Does it give the same commercial impression, which is the greatest of tests ever, but it's one of the factors. And then the relatedness of the goods, not the same goods, but are they related? And if a source sells both goods, for example, sneakers and t-shirts, they can be related. So it can be really hard to get a sense of what is an obstacle, and it's more of an art than a science. So you really, early in the process, before launching under a slogan or a business, you do want to have someone experienced trademark lawyer look at that. And the consequences of not doing it are dire. If you start and you branch or you launch a brand and you're going and then you get a cease and desist letter or an infringement lawsuit, it's not a lot of fun to respond to that. It puts the brakes on the business. It's expensive and distracting and stressful. And then on a lesser extent, if you file an application, it's going to be rejected. The USPTO is going to reject your application if there's an infringing mark or a confusingly similar mark already registered. Go to the next slide now. So the registration itself, do you have to do it? And the answer is no. You can just pick a trademark and start using it. But there's a lot of misunderstanding around that. And I wanted to clear it up now as you're thinking about brands. The first is, I've heard numerous times when someone says, well, don't worry, I created a corporation or an LLC and ABC LLC. So ABC is protected as a trademark. And that's not the case. That's just the entity name. Now, if you start using it as a mark without registering it, you may get what are called common law rights in that mark. You can develop that without registering it, but they're very limited. They're only in the geographic areas where you use the mark. So if you're just in New England for now, but you've got plans to go out to California and West Coast, those common law rights only protect you there. And if someone in California picks up the same mark and starts using it in their region, you're having competing rights. That's a problem down the road. That's one part that's limited. And second is it's hard to enforce. When you go into court, you actually have to put on evidence and convince the judge or jury, depending, that it is a trademark, that it's a source identifier, and that's hard to do. And before I get into why it's easier with registration, keep in mind, registration can be at the state level. You can get a New Hampshire trademark, a Massachusetts trademark, an Idaho trademark, but it's only protecting you in that state. The USPTO is the government agency. If you get it registered there, it's across the whole country, even if you're not there yet. So that's really important. And then foreign registration, if for instance, you're going to Canada or Mexico or EU, you can get foreign registrations. You have to apply in those countries. But if you're a US country or business and you get your registration here in the States, you can use treaties that make it easier to go across to foreign countries, which is really important these days. But to just give you a sense so you have this in mind, when you pick your brand, why you should be registering it early. Protected in all states, I mentioned that. The use of that circle R symbol, it sounds funny, but it actually adds a lot of validity to your brand. And it is a good way to prevent otherwise innocent infringers from not using your mark. They'll see that and they know it means something. It means some kind of protection and they might back off. But the real biggest benefit of putting yourself in the USPTO database is kind of what Kelly alluded to before. She said we own that mark. You're in the USPTO database first when other companies or businesses go look to see if a mark's available. If they're doing the right thing, they're going to go check the database, and you're there. It's going to stop people from doing it in most cases. But also the USPTO is going to do some work for you. If you register it, then if someone else comes forward to register a confusingly similar mark, the USPTO USPTO is going to reject that application. They're going to keep it out for you. And then finally, it strengthens your enforcement efforts. I mentioned enforcing common law rights is hard, and it is. Having a registration gives you certain presumptions that make it easier should you ever have to sue someone, but also it just gives weight to the cease and desist letter you sent out. But also from a practical standpoint, nowadays, a lot of the infringement happens online, and social media providers, Meta, et cetera, they're going to require you to have a registered trademark to take down infringing content that infringes your mark. That's a requirement these days, with certain exceptions. And then if you're selling on Amazon, which most people are these days, being products, the Amazon brand registry is almost necessary. And to get into that Amazon brand registry, you have to have either a trademark or a pending trademark application. So it's really, really important to have the registration. Next slide, please. And I'll end here, but just to give you a sense, the registration process, it's not overly expensive. People get nervous, but it's $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 highest for a standard application, which can sound like a lot, but dealing with not having a registration is much more. You have two options. You can do it in use, which is when you're using the mark. But more importantly, this is something you should think about in the early stages of your brand. You can file what's called an intent to use application, which is exactly what it sounds like. You're telling the USPTO that you intend to use the mark, and you can get that application in. The priority date is when you file it. And then later on, so long as you start using it in commerce 3 years after it's approved, then you'll get the registration. So it's a smart way to get your rights to it before you launch and make a big splash, and then other people get interested in the mark. The last thing, the wait times, I mentioned it only because when you file that application, you have 8 months of waiting essentially for the USPTO to pick up the application. That's why clearance is so important. You got to have a good read before you file it. And my last piece of advice is just do it right the first time. There's a good chunk of my work where someone comes to me having not cleared the mark, having not registered it, and responded to a cease and desist letter or a lawsuit. It's messy, it's stressful, it's expensive. You don't want to be in that spot. It is much, much safer and better to do it right out the gates. So I'm going to pass it back to the fun stuff now, getting into the branding. And thank you for humoring the lawyer who gives you the early advice.
Thank you, Brian. That was wonderful. Really helpful information and great thought starters. Just to bring it back, how can you find your North Star? Define your purpose, layer on your most important audiences. Once you've identified that North Star, make decisions with that in mind. And then last, but certainly not least, call Brian, because he will help you out and save you some trouble.
Awesome. So once you've defined your North Star, you want to kind of do the same thing with your goals. Articulate the goal that you are trying to accomplish with your brand and with your marketing. So you have a ton of different goals when you're running a business, right? You may need to drive website traffic. You need to reach new customers. You need to sell products. But what you want to do is narrow that down to the one priority goal. So know what all of those goals are, but prioritize one and turn it into that mark on the wall that you are looking at every day. You might be thinking, well, obviously that's driving revenue, right? But I think what's most helpful in this situation is to think about it in terms of a consumer behavior. What behavior do you want your consumers or customers to do in order to drive that sales or drive that revenue? So going back to the Saddleback example, they're a ski mountain and they had a bunch of different goals, right? They've got to drive lift ticket revenue. They've got to drive food and beverage revenue. They've got to drive rentals. But what's the one behavior that we want skiers to do in order to drive all of those business goals, and it's visit the mountain. So they have a goal called skier visits, and it's essentially the number of days that people visit the mountain over the course of the winter. And that was their mark on the wall. So once they were able to say, hey, our goal is to drive people to the mountain, it's to get as many skier visits as possible, they could then use that as a filter for all of the marketing and branding decisions that they're making. When they're putting a campaign in market, is it driving skier visits? Is it driving people to the mountain? Should we do this activation versus this activation? What's going to drive people to the mountain? And what it also does is it makes it really easy to understand if you're having success with your branding and marketing efforts, because you're able to look at that core metric and say, okay, we've got a lot of other performance indicators on how we might be doing, but how are we doing on driving that number one goal? That's our North Star from an objectives perspective. So you can see how Saddleback started to do that, and bringing in messaging, bringing in media placements that were all put through the lens of, is this following our North Star of being Maine's favorite mountain, and is it following the North Star of our objectives in terms of driving skier visits? And that was really effective for them.
Another case study that we'd like to talk through, different sector from Saddleback, insurance. You can also have a well-articulated singular goal for a specific facet of the business. So in Colonial Life's case, their North Star is protecting people's lives. They needed to reach more agents. So they essentially needed a specific goal to reach those agents. And it wasn't about getting more insurance agents to sell Colonial Life products and services. It was about encouraging entrepreneurs, those who are not currently considering insurance as a viable career, to reach them and talk about all of the benefits of becoming an insurance agent. Now, this is a really hard task, because what we unearthed within putting that goal forward, how do we reach non-insurance considering entrepreneurs to consider insurance? That's a really challenging singular goal. We had to look at a kind of a human truth about the insurance industry, which came to, it feels a little weird to say you want to sell insurance. It's got used car salesman sort of connotations to it from a general population standpoint. So we said, why don't we call a spade a spade? If the goal is to reach non-insurance agents, let's talk about a human truth. Nobody wants to sell insurance. And this resonated quite well with their current agents, who sort of already live and breathe the organization's goals and North Star. So we put this forward in talking about the benefits of being an independent insurance sales agent, actually have all of the benefits that younger entrepreneurs are actually looking for. It's flipping the script and talking about the ways that Colonial Life fulfills that. So to Greer's point about Saddleback, you sort of go all in on that specific North Star, and we speak to entrepreneurs in a way that is benefit driven, that they may not expect in order to achieve that goal. And it worked. That was the last slide. It worked quite well. I think we tripled the number of incoming lead gen leads per day and per week that they had set out as their goal in the beginning. So how do you articulate that one goal? As Greer mentioned, there's sort of a lot of pieces to articulating that one singular goal. The first is to sort of sit and audit all of your goals and ambitions. What are the plethora of things that you want and need to achieve? Put those on the wall, and then start to articulate, start to circle, highlight, what are the things that are the most important that actually affect everything else. That's defining the number one goal. And then make it a constant. Put it on the wall in an office, in a cubicle, in a manufacturing plant. It's sort of like the Notre Dame football thing that they slap when they run out of the tunnel. That is the thing that they work towards every single day. Make it a constant and align your team around it so that your team knows exactly what that mark on the wall is at every turn. And as we said, every single business decision comes back to that one singular goal.
So the next piece is being an expert in your category and your competition. So when we think about the category, we know that you want to be distinct from the brands that you are competing with, but you don't just want to think about the brands that you're competing with. You want to know what you compete with, of course, not just who your competitors are. So let me give you a couple of examples of this distinction. So going back to Saddleback and weaving that thread, Saddleback is a ski resort. So of course, their main competitive set is other New England ski resorts. So they're looking at Sugarloaf, Loon, Sunday River, Gunstock, among the many other great ski resorts that are in New England, to think of how are they positioning themselves? What makes us different? But they also need to go beyond just looking at ski resorts, because when a consumer is thinking about making that choice of if they should go to Saddleback or not, they're not always comparing, oh, should I go to Sugarloaf or should I go to Saddleback this weekend? They might be thinking about, oh, should I go ice skating or should I go skiing this weekend? Should I stay home and get cozy by the fire while I have a hot chocolate and read a book? Going skiing this weekend. So by expanding that aperture and looking not just at your competitors, but at the whole category and at every kind of thing that you might be competing with, you can start to say, okay, what is most compelling about my brand that would have them choose us when they're looking at this larger consideration set? Another example is Merrell. So Merrell is, an outdoor hiking boot brand. So of course, they are looking at other hiking boot brands, Danner, A-Solos, and those brands that you find in an REI or an EMS. Core hikers are going to be looking to buy when they're considering buying a hiking boot. But if you start to expand beyond that, you start to see new opportunities arise. So one thing that we discovered when we were working with Merrell is that there were a lot of new hikers coming into the category, and they didn't even really know about hiking boots. They were hiking in things like flip-flops, which to a hiker might seem crazy, but if you're just starting out, why couldn't you just wear a pair of flip-flops on a hike? They were hiking in their Nikes and their Converse. Once we expanded the aperture here beyond just the typical hiking boot competitive set, we were able to see that there was a whole new audience that we actually needed to deliver a different message to and educate around the benefits of footwear that is specific to the activity that they're doing. So again, it is absolutely knowing what your competitors are doing, but it's expanding beyond that to say, what is the larger category and what's the larger competitive set that I need to look at? So how can you be the category expert? Audit your category. Make sure you're looking at all of the other brands that are doing similar things to what you're doing and try to figure out what makes us different or distinct within that. And then look outside of that. Look outside to the broader category and then own your niche within that. And start creating around your expertise, whether it's messaging or products. Once you know what that larger landscape is, you can narrow in on who you are within that and why people should choose you over any of the other options.
Okay, principle number 4 here, entrench yourself in your core customer. Core being a very important word. So we're going to talk about knowing your core customer before articulating your prospective customer and going beyond the demographics. So you want to understand who you're speaking to. I think one of the mistakes that many partners of ours come to the table with is they know what their North Star is, they know what their goal is, and they say, well, those are the customers that we need to reach. what they're skipping over in that exercise is, who are the customers that you already have? What do you know about them? Where do their loyalties lie? Why did they choose you as a product or as an experience or as a service? That's sort of a foundational piece to building to that prospective customer. And what do we mean by go well beyond the demographics? We have an outdoor apparel client partner who needed to really understand their core customer, but beyond the demographics. So a lot of times we see customer profiles that exist of gender, age, household income, geographic location. That is necessary, especially for targeting exercises and being able to know sort of on paper, demographically, who the customer is. What we need to do is start to peel back the layers and get more of the emotional side. The technical term for it is psychographic. So you want the demographic and the psychographic side in understanding what is motivating your core customer. Why did they choose you, or why did they not choose you? Or why are they not even thinking about brand choice? What brings them into the category in the first place? What is the emotive piece that's going to trigger a conversation with your brand? We also want to ensure that we're talking about our core customer. We have another top of the mountain apparel brand who started to talk to this customer on the left, sort of outdoor technical apparel, but worn for lifestyle. That's all good and well because they want that customer as well, but their core customer was the one on the right, the one skinning up mountains to ski down. That's the core customer that they started to lose sight of. So if you think about this going both ways, it's much more challenging to articulate the aspirational customer and move back to the core customer than it is really understanding your core customer and how that extends well beyond. So how do you start to unearth a lot of those kind of psychographic elements? It's peeling back the layers. A lot of client partners will say, well, we need to do a tracking study or we need to do a survey. Before you do that, go on a ride along. Figure out what your customer is doing. If they're in the ski industry, find some skiers, go skiing with them. The best insights you're going to gain are on the chairlift or as you're skiing down a mountain. If you're a manufacturer of footwear, speak to customers who use that footwear the most. What are the things they love? What are the things they hate? Research for psychographics doesn't have to be expensive and it doesn't have to be exorbitant. We've had the good fortune of being in locker rooms for sports equipment, for skiing and riding, and this is mostly for outdoors clients. All of this complements things like website analytics and surveys and all of the things that are sort of so helpful in grounding the quantitative side. You definitely want both the qualitative and the quantitative to start to build your core customer persona. So how do we start to do that? As I said, ride along, get out there with your core customer. This extends beyond consumer goods as well. On the B2B side, go on a sales tour, talk to your sales team, ride along with them, understand what it is that is most resonant about that process, and then back it up with data. You need an ingoing sort of instinctual notion to make data work the best for you. And data doesn't have to be a crazy expensive, long drawn out process. It's easy to conduct a survey, either with your own database or paying a small nominal fee for listservs. People like to talk about their experiences. Leverage that within understanding your consumers and customers. And then build a detailed customer persona. It doesn't have to be a crazy, tough exercise. Write down the things that you know are on the hearts and minds of the sort of demographic profile that you know. Listen, engage, and adapt. Constantly listen, ask questions of your customers, of prospective customers, of competitors' customers, and adapt accordingly.
Thank you. Number 5, very important one as we talk to marketers and business owners, get your marketing priorities straight. So similar to finding your North Star and expressing your brand, marketing is about prioritization. You don't have to be everything to everyone. You don't have to be everywhere either. Something that we like to say here is outsmart, don't outspend. Have a laser focus on the places and spaces you can reach your core customer, and especially when you have smaller budgets. I'm going to share a real world example that, again, back to Saddleback. So as Saddleback was trying to get back on people's minds as a viable option, they wanted to target people in the Boston area. There is an annual ski show in Boston, and we decided to take over both North and South Station with digital billboards for the weekend surrounding this convention. And this was really smart because we had customers that were already interested in the outdoors and skiing. And then we hit them with the Saddleback messaging. Everywhere you turned in North and South Station, they could see our messaging, Maine's favorite mountain. And this proved to be very successful. Another place that we also put some media was in Portland at the Cross Insurance Arena, where the local hockey team plays. Again, thinking about our core customers, people who are engaging in winter activities, people with families, and people who can commute to the mountain easily. Again, this was a really fun, creative opportunity to get our messaging out there, and also was proven successful. Some key takeaways for how to establish your priorities. Survey your marketing and development infrastructure. This has a lot to do with your budget. Be honest, and then be smart. Identify some key priorities, and then allocate your resources wisely.
Number 6, find your crew. So if you've done all this work with the other principles of finding your North Star and prioritizing and setting your goal, it'll be a lot easier to find partners to help you amplify your message. And when you know your unique values well enough, you can find those other like-minded partners really easily, and they can have a big impact for you. So a couple examples here. As we pull Saddleback through the thread of all of these different principles, they were Maine's favorite mountain. They are Maine's favorite mountain. So in terms of partnerships, it made a ton of sense to partner with one of Maine's favorite and most famous skiers, Donnie Pelletier. He is a skiing influencer, has a really big following. He's a Mainer. His whole thing is about being a Mainer skier. So it was a no-brainer. It was, duh, let's partner with him. And what we were able to do with that was extend the reach of the messaging that we were putting out there, so that we were able to hit a whole new audience and a much bigger audience than we would have with just our media dollars doing a social media placement or something like that. But because we had those values so crystallized, it was very easy to identify that partner and then figure out a way to work with him. Another example is with Stio, one of our clients, and their North Star is really all around living the mountain life. It's around those hardcore people who live in the mountains and love to play in the mountains. So when they were looking for partners and collaborators, they partnered with KSX Art, which is an artist out of Bozeman who takes these natural things from the natural world and makes these beautiful prints. This made a ton of sense because she also embodied that North Star of the mountain life. They did a apparel collaboration with her that sold out in 8 minutes flat. They were able to leverage her following, their marketing dollars, bring it all together to promote this beautiful Stio collaboration, and it drove sales. So I think the power of partnerships is really strong, and especially when they're perfectly aligned with the brand that you're building. So to find your crew, list out other brands that you feel like share your values, that have a similar vibe, that seem like they are related in some way. Build a criteria set for yourself. Have a litmus test. Say, okay, if our North Star is XYZ, is this partner, is that a value that they align with as well? And when you build that criteria set, it just makes it a lot easier to evaluate who you want to partner with. And then build a collaborative, mutually beneficial relationship. Other brands and influencers and people out there, they are going to want to partner if you're building a relationship that is mutually beneficial. And it really usually can be and is. And when it is, it's very, very powerful for both brands.
They're going to leave me with the hardest one. Chart your future, number 7. We actually have a proprietary tool here that we use to help our clients understand directionally where they want to go. It's very technical, the magic 8-ball. In all seriousness, it is very challenging to figure out where to take a brand after you've gone through all of the steps of articulating your North Star, getting to your goal, understanding your customers, understanding where your North Star lives within white space in the category, identifying all of your partners, your aligned partners, where to grow, how to scale. Growth and scaling do not have one definition. It could be that you're trying to acquire more customers. It could also be that you need less customers, but more qualified leads. Identifying that, that futuristic singular goal is really important. We had one client partner who came to us with the singular goal of increased revenue year over year. Is that a wrong sort of future direction? No, but the pivot, it's not wrong, but the pivot is they actually needed to drive more visitors to the market instead of focus on the dollar signs. And what that started to do over 2, 3, 4 years was driving more visitors to the market brought revenue with it. So charting your future, how do we do this? Define your definition of growth. As I mentioned, is it more customers? Is it more qualified customers? Is it new markets? Is it new products? Try to distill exactly what those paths to growth are. And then innovate and find proactive ways to serve the audience. Is it a white space? Is it a product or service that doesn't exist? Is it a pain point? Knowing your customers and knowing the competition will start to lead you towards these growth paths. Craft a long-term vision and start with the short-term vision. What do you want to achieve in 6 months? What do you want to achieve in 1 year? What is the 5-year goal? Write those down, put them on the wall. A year later, you might be in a very different place, but you're working towards that growth path and identifying ways to innovate and adapt as you move. Seek out the right growth models and the right partners, and conduct quarterly brand assessments. It's really beneficial to sit down on a quarterly basis and say, where are we headed? What do we know from our data that we're really liking? Where do we see holes? Where do we see holes to plug? Do that on a quarterly basis, even if it's just a conversation with either your management team or your entire team. Gain input from the most important folks within that growth process. We like to say huck and pray, but huck and pray strategically. Know what those growth paths are, and then take chances, test and refine as you move so that those chances are very calculated. We work with Maine Health, which is the largest healthcare system in northern New England. It also services New Hampshire as well. And during the pandemic, we put this ad out into the ether to say, listen, we're in a pandemic right now. We can't predict the future, but we can certainly be prepared for it. So when we think about futuristic growth, it is about preparation to allow you to adapt and move with the growth goals in mind. We've done quite a bit of sharing here. Hopefully most of you are still with us. We'd love to open the floor for any questions.
Thank you, Meranne, and team in general, Greer and Kelly and Brian. We do have questions from the audience, and I have some questions as well. First, great job, fascinating, and some really creative examples that you showed. So thank you. Our first question from the audience, I want to take this and sort of expand on it a little bit. The question at its core is, and I think this was for Brian, it came in during his section, but was in terms of the protection of trademark, what about the registration of a URL? And the question of whether that applies globally. And I would just add on to that, domain names, social media handles in general, how do brands protect and police their identity with all of these different things that people can just sort of snatch up and use perhaps and find it very difficult to get them to stop using them if they're using them on social media, for example.
Yeah, I can answer the question about the URL first. Generally speaking, when you register a domain, you have the right to use it globally. So it's across the board. The one thing you want to be careful of is, like an entity name, registering a domain for a term doesn't give you trademark rights in the term. So you'd have to still use it as a trademark in the countries in which you want to protect it. And then I think the second part of the question was enforcing these marks across social media and the internet. And the answer is it's really challenging. Big companies have their own internal teams that are constantly searching for this and looking for use. It's almost like whack-a-mole sometimes, especially on platforms like Amazon. But more and more, there's some platforms that use AI to scrub the internet and find uses of marks and social media handles and things that might be infringing. And then when you find one, it's a very nuanced decision as to whether to attack it or not, based on resources, based on whether it's actually confusing and that kind of thing. So it's a mishmash of your own elbow grease and then also using some of the tools that are emerging now.
I would say from a marketing perspective too, when you are deciding on a brand or a product name, one of the first things that you can do along with that trademark search is do a URL search and a social media handle search, and just go ahead and reserve those even before you decide to go for your trademark, or before that's in motion. You can always reserve the URL. They're typically very cheap, like $10 a year. And you can, reserve those social media handles because you'd rather have them than not have them, even if you're not using them, because you don't want another brand to come along and use them too. We also sometimes grab related URLs and handles. So if it's not exactly the name of your company or your product, you still might want to buy it and have it just so that someone else can't have it and cause confusion in the market as well.
Greer, great point. And I think a follow-up to that is, as you're watching companies maybe develop brands, how much is that brand development and even company naming now driven by what's available as a domain name?
It can be quite driven by that. I mean, if a domain name is taken, it might dissuade us from recommending that as a brand name, especially if, usually what that means is that URL is attached to another brand name as well. So that will often tell you like if something's already being used, and probably you won't be able to own that within the market. Although at this point, I would say many domains have been claimed. And so sometimes you have to get a little more creative with your URL than just having the straight brandname.com. There are a lot of smaller brands and companies now leveraging different endings. So not just the .com, but .nh, right? .me, .co. And when you do those URL searches on, you can do those on things like, Squarespace or whatever web host that you're using. You can see what all of those options are. And those are options for you to grab as well.
I imagine, Brian, that's another argument towards, I think when you gave examples of the different kind of brand names that you could have, you had Netflix in a sweet spot right in the middle, where it's a made up word, but it's associated with these two different elements. That's got to make it easier to find a domain name if you're approaching it from that perspective as well.
Yeah, 100%. And that's the push and pull between good branding, where you want to give some signal, and strong, easier to protect marks. That isn't always the same. And the other thing I'll add, and I think Greer was touching on this, from a non-legal standpoint, sometimes I say the mark is clear. There are other people using the mark, but it's not for related goods and services. But there's these other brands that have the same mark. Do you want to be swimming in the same pool as them? When the person types it in and sees you as number 1 or number 2 in Google search, do you want them to have to toggle between that and figure out which one you are, or think there's an affiliation there, even though you're clear from a legal standpoint to use the mark? So that's another thing that should go into your internet search and your domain search as well.
Excellent. So a question, I think this is for everyone, really. I think there are legal implications and certainly creative implications here. What about when brands are doing a refresh? Hostess has just announced a new logo, and there's a long history of iconic brands launching new logos, from Apple to Starbucks and so forth. When you're doing that, on a creative side, what do brands have to be careful about? And then on a legal side, is there a legal trademark issue when you change your logo?
I can speak a little bit from the creative side. I mean, I think we see brands over time, logos typically don't change completely after they're established, but there's a lot of evolution that happens as the market changes and as brands modernize. And then, of course, when there are mergers and different companies, reposition themselves, you might change those. I think, creatively, it's a process. You don't want to do that willy-nilly. Your logo is a really important part of your branding. It's not the only part that makes up your brand, but it's the core signal of that it is your company. And so you want to be strategic about it, and you want to be asking questions like, what are these changes going to signal and cue to our consumer, our customer? And why are we trying to make these changes, right? Is there something, what do we want to accomplish by making these changes? So I would say less watch outs and more, I would tell everyone to just really approach those things very thoughtfully, with a strategic process in mind, versus just saying, we don't like our logo, let's quickly change it. Whatever you're developing, you want to make sure that it's signaling the right things you want to signal about your brand, and that it's going to resonate with the consumer you're trying to reach.
That's a great point, Greer. And one thing I would just add on is really thinking about your consumer, because sometimes humans don't like change. And even something so nuanced or a small update might really rub the consumers the wrong way, and it might have a negative impact on their relationship and connection to the brand. So being really sure that, and that can happen with focus groups, with doing some research, talking to people before you go all in on a big change.
And one thing I'll add from kind of a legal standpoint, but I can't talk specifics, but I've had situations in the past where, representing a brand, they know people are watching, and the branding folks want to have a splash at the right time. And the lawyers are saying, well, register it as soon as possible on an intent to use basis, but that's all public. So when people see that brand X is going to rebrand with this new logo, and there's fanatics out there that watch, and this gets out, there's a timing issue too. You have to keep in mind that if you go registered, that's all public, and it should be part of your big brand strategy as to when you want to release that and how.
So when you change that logo, you do have to go re-register it?
If you want to protect it, yes. And that's why, the overzealous lawyers are going to say, well, do the intent to use now, so no one jumps ahead of you. But
yeah.
Branding says, well, no, this is supposed to come out the right way and with the right splash and the right venues. So there is that decision to make as well.
Oh, wow. So, well, I think that brings us to the top of the hour. So I want to take this opportunity to thank our audience for joining us today. We appreciate you. Thank you to the Brian from Sheehan Phinney, and to Sheehan Phinney for sponsoring today's presentation, and to Meranne and Greer and Kelly from Words from the Woods. You guys were fantastic. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.